Good evening, muy buenas tardes. Welcome to Instituto Cervantes, Manchester. It is a great honor to have you participating in this International Week of Spanish Literature, which is being celebrated in 3 different Institutos Cervantes in the world, Manila, New York, and Manchester. Muchas gracias, James Horner, Isabel Greenberg y Quan Zhou Wu, por acompañarnos en este evento que es muy especial y tiene un significado muy especial para el Instituto Cervantes. Benengeli, la Semana Internacional de las Letras en Español, es un programa en red de los 3 centros de Instituto Cervantes en las ciudades de Manila, Manchester y Nueva York, y que tiene como tema central la narrativa de autoficción. Además de las mesas redondas en estas 3 ciudades de 3 continentes, tendremos también la oportunidad de disfrutar de una serie de vídeos y de podcasts en los que escritores, libreros, traductores, agentes literarios, periodistas y académicos nos van a dar una muestra del mundo literario en español de manera global, abordando aspectos tan diferentes como la traducción y sus desafíos, los intereses de los lectores anglófonos por la literatura en español o el papel que juegan las revistas digitales y analógicas y, como no, el papel también de las redes sociales en la difusión de las nuevas voces en los países de habla inglesa. Jorge Luis Borges definió el paraíso en uno de sus maravillosos libros que sería algo como una biblioteca. Los libros efectivamente nos acompañan desde la infancia y nos hacen disfrutar de la vida, pero disfrutar la vida de otra manera, disfrutar de muchas vidas realmente. Cervantes, en su genial literatura llena también de infinita sabiduría y filosofía, nos lo dice de manera muy clara y dice: el que lee mucho y anda mucho, ve mucho y sabe mucho. En este programa pretendemos eso, acercar el público a la literatura desde diferentes formatos, desde diferentes lenguajes y acercarnos también a la vida y a la escritura de los autores que participáis, un mundo en el que se conjugan las experiencias personales y la ficción y que además a través de las imágenes, tratándose de novela gráfica, no solo nos facilitáis el acceso a vuestra obra, sino que además esas mismas imágenes de esos hermosos libros son en sí misma un lenguaje narrativo lleno de significado. Bueno, pues sin más, voy a continuación a dar una breve reseña de James Corek, el moderador, quien será después el encargado de presentar a nuestras invitadas. James Corek es profesor titular de Estudios Culturales Latinoamericanos del Departamento de Estudios Españoles, Portugueses y Latinoamericanos de la Universidad de Manchester. Sus investigaciones se centran en los imaginarios urbanos latinoamericanos, particularmente de los de Buenos Aires, y en la producción cultural latinoamericana, especialmente la fotografía y el cómic. Actualmente es investigador principal del proyecto Comics and Race en Latinoamérica y es autor del libro Ciudad en Común, Cultura y Comunidad en Buenos Aires. Muchísimas gracias a los 3 por acompañarnos. Espero que el público disfrute del evento y tienes la palabra, James. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for the invitation to moderate this discussion, and thanks to Isabel and Quan for joining us. I will start by giving a brief biography of both authors, and then I will sort of launch into some questions, and then we'll see where the discussion leads us. So Quan Zhou is an author, illustrator, graphic novelist, digital designer, and instructor. She grew up in Andalusia before also spending time in Madrid and in the UK. She describes herself as Spanish, but not too much. And her work explores questions of race and identity, not least in relation to issues of immigration and second-generation migrant families. Following her series of short comics produced for El País's online edition, she published her first graphic novel, Gazpacho and Agridulce, which translates as sweet and sour gazpacho, in 2015 with Astiberri. And the book sequel, Andaluchinas por el Mundo, which roughly translates as Andalus Chinese around the world, was released in 2017. Her most recent work, Gente de aquí y Gente allí, people from over here, people from over there, is a graphic essay published in 2020 about national identity, particularly Spanish national identity in relation to migration, race, and racism. Isabel Greenberg is an illustrator, writer, graphic novelist, and lecturer who has degrees in illustration and animation. She's published 3 graphic novels with Jonathan Cape, all of which, in different shapes and forms, explore the power of the imagination and stories and storytelling. Her first graphic novel, The Encyclopedia of Early Earth, was published in 2015 and was followed by The 100 Nights of Hero 2 years later. And then her most recent work, Glasstown, which was published last year, is based on the juvenilia of the Bronte siblings. In addition to her graphic novels, she's also illustrated many children's books and history books, some in conjunction with her sister Imogen. And she has also had work exhibited at the V&A, Cecil Sharp House, and Garda. So I'd like to start with you, Isabel, if I may, with a question about storytelling, because your work often explores myths and how myths and stories shape the destiny of characters that you depict. And it strikes me that even though a lot of the time we're talking about very imaginative worlds, the fictions don't seem to me anyway to be about sort of means of escape so much as thinking about how people are positioned in a wider kind of social context and their relationship with each other and with the world, which may be nature as much as it is people. So I was just wondering how you saw the role of storytelling in your work and whether you think your own work has that kind of social function to some degree.
I mean, I definitely like to think so. I think what interests me about kind of the more, I guess, traditional forms of storytelling is the kind of, I guess, the universality of the story structures. So I think there's an essay by Philip Pullman in which he talks about how fairy tales travel very light. So it's very much like you're working with these archetypes. So it might be a sort of Cinderella type story, but essentially the characters are so flimsy, they're so thin. You have a wicked stepmother, a wise old crone, a plucky young man, but that doesn't sort of describe who the characters are. And so what you're working with is these the bones of a story that maybe that everyone is familiar with and everyone knows, but the characters themselves are so sort of transient that the more you flesh them out, the more different people flesh them out, the stories are the same but also so different. And that's what I like about them. And I think there's a familiarity to a certain type of story that we can all relate to, but at the same time you can continually play with them and retell them in sort of fresh ways. So I think that's why I love playing with this idea of like storytelling and the traditional mythologies and legends, because there's a sort of fascinating sameness to the stories, but also for me they can just be continually replayed and they feel fresh. I think that's, sorry, I'm not sure if that's totally answered your question.
No, definitely. And in fact, leads me on to another question I'm going to ask you both, but I wonder if that in that sense you feel that, or how do you feel that your works travel through translation? Because I know some of your works have been translated. I mean, do you think that makes it, would that make it easier for a translator in a sense to sort of reshape them or rejig them for a different audience? Or do you think there are aspects of your work that might be quite challenging for a translator to grapple with?
That's a really interesting question. Do you know what? I'm not sure, because I've never actually spoken to the translator. I think it probably depends what language and what. I think my first 2 books, which are sort of more about, which play with folk tales and mythology, I imagine that for those there may have been kind of language specific nuances and wordplay that could have kind of been interchangeable. So a kind of, I mean, I'm not sure, but I would imagine. I suspect my latest one, Glasstown, might have been trickier because the subject matter is so rooted in the place. But yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, the thing is, I don't speak a second language well enough to really get anything like the sort of enough of an understanding to know how the translation really works. My favorite thing about seeing my books in translation actually is seeing how the sound effects translate.
Right.
So things like animal noises, or haha, or door creaking, things like that. I love seeing how the sound effects translate. That's been great.
And the images themselves, of course, create a sort of sense of continuity between the source text and the translated text. Right?
Yeah, I think so. I hope so. I love seeing my work in translation. So, and yeah, all 3 of my books are available in Spanish, I should say.
Right.
Yeah. I hope that it works the same way. I think there is a lot of, I like to use like wordplay and you know, maybe like colloquialisms and stuff, but I think I imagine that works. You know, I imagine it's replaceable.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Quan Zhou, if I could just turn to you then, because I mean, your work hasn't yet been translated, but I wanted to sort of ask you the same question, because I suppose, as Isabel was saying there about her most recent work, I mean, your work is very much rooted in a specific context and a specific place. So I was wondering, you know, how well you think those works would sort of travel. I mean, perhaps your latest work you might see as perhaps being more universal. I don't know. And again, what kind of challenges do you think a translator might face when presented with your work?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank you for the Instituto Cervantes for inviting me in this roundtable. I'm very happy. Secondly, excuse my rusty Spanish because I'm not native English, but I tend to mix all of Spanish and English all over the table. So I think my language is not totally English. So apart from that, yes, I'm very, because I understand English, I understand Spanish. For me, it will be challenging to translate it, especially the 2 first graphic novels, because Gazpacho Agridulce, it's a very Spanish joke. It's very local. So I really don't know if people, for example, from the UK or from the US will actually get what the title is about. So it's not the literal translation, but it will need to root in a local way the same joke. And also for the Andalucinas por el mundo, no? Like Andalucinas around the world. So I think it will be challenging because I also do not know if the story that I tell is universal enough. Because some of the people can relate of what I talk about identity issues and about how you're born Chinese in another foreign countries, they can relate to that. But there's so many jokes that are not even Spanish, they're Andalusian, that are, for example, in the first graphic novel. So I will kind of like really need to work with the translation team to see how we can figure this out, because it's really not literal translation. It is how we can communicate the same in another language and in another culture. I find that challenging as for me to have the same personality in Spanish or in English, because that's the language also influences your personality. And I notice it even when I am speaking in English. For example, for me, it's challenging to be as witty and as communicative in English as I am in Spanish. And it really frustrates me as a person that speaks a lot. It become very frustrating.
So I suppose sort of related to that, and I also wanted to ask you about storytelling and myths, because that's also something that crops up in your work, right? I mean, the kinds of stories that you know, your for example, your guardian when you were children, or your mother, and the kind of conflicting stories and narratives that appear as part of that context, and the fact that often in your case stories are kind of tied up with stereotypes in different shapes and forms. And so I wanted to know how you tread that precarious balance between sort of playing with stereotypes as a way of breaking them down, and also sort of running the risk of sort of almost reproducing those stereotypes, if that's something you're kind of conscious of as you work.
Well, I consciously do it now, but I wasn't consciously portraying it when I published Gazpacho Agridulce. As you mentioned, it was in 2015. I was 26-year-old. I had no education towards making a script or towards making a graphic novel. For me, it was kind of I always say in Spanish, un vómito, like a vomit or things that I wanted to say for memories I had. So then I realized that there was some stereotypes in there, and there was some stuff that it was difficult to manage. So sorting it out, I studied about stereotype, I studied about prejudice, and I studied how races affect that after publishing my work, because I guess there were 2 points, like my life path, and what I was writing and what I was drawing about. So I think sometimes when I write, it connects. For example, for me, it was very important in the creation of the first and the second graphic novel, like building the characters and building the characters that were believable for the people. So many of the people love the character of my mom. And to make a real character, somebody that you can connect, you need to empathize. Well, it made me understand a lot the struggles that the first generation of migrants having coming here, because it made me think how they were feeling about how they're feeling about going into a country that they know nothing, that they do not know the language, and how is having a child that you cannot properly communicate. I mean, all the childs are difficult to communicate with, but in this case, the cultural ocean is huge. Even with the language, music, the food that we ate, the people we relate. So imagine having a child that you don't understand, but also with this cultural barrier. It must be really, really difficult for them. So it's not just the prejudice, the stereotype over the racism, it's also an act of empathizing with parents, and especially the first generation of migrants that came here, and also understanding why do we think that prejudice, where do we learn these stereotypes and how we learn to behave like this. So it was encountering all of this while creating my work. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's very interesting that you refer to characterization of people. It's one of the things I noticed about your work, particularly the early stuff, but I think also the last work is there's so much emphasis on expression, on characters' faces, and not so much on where they are or the kind of backgrounds. Like, in fact, your work has very little background to characters. It's a lot of it is about expression, and people get angry, and it's incredibly kind of evocative of those kinds of emotions. So I think that struck me as something very powerful. I don't know if that was something you were doing on purpose.
No, I think it's something. No, it's, well, for one side, I'm just lazy. I don't like drawing backgrounds. It really bores me, and I don't like it. But also, it was really important for me, yeah, for the people to connect, like to connect with a reality that was invisible. For example, in Spain, it's very easy to see if you're a migrant or you're a local, but there's something in between. For example, we are the mixture. We're invisible. We don't fit, and we don't totally belong in the migrant population, neither the local. So it is totally invisible. So it was a reality that I want to purposely show to you. First, the migrant people that you think that they're unreachable, that they don't integrate themselves, that they do not relate, and see how in the end, the feelings are super similar, because we are human beings. Like, this person is no random person for outer space that have super random feelings that we cannot connect or feel related to. We are humans. So it was very important for me, that showing that it's this simple, but people just tend to forget that we are people and we do feel.
Thank you. So if I can come back to you, Isabel, on that, because by contrast, your work is incredibly kind of dense. I mean, the panels are very dense in terms of sort of background, landscapes, maps, symbols, imagery. It seems like a very time-consuming process to sort of even put together one frame. Is that right?
I think I've developed a visual language that I can work with quite fast. I think anyone who makes graphic novels or comics knows that it's a long form medium, so I think you have to find shortcuts, and I think my work takes less time than I think people might think looking at it. Each graphic novel has taken me in terms of the actual drawing process maybe just under a year, which I think sounds like a long time, but really, when you consider how long they are, and doing other things alongside isn't so long really. But yeah, I think you have to develop a shorthand and a way of working that you can do quickly, because otherwise you would never make a 200-page book. But for sure there are things that you like, yeah, Quan was saying you don't like backgrounds. Like there's definitely things I hate drawing, like pages of dialogue where there's two characters talking and you have to get through like a whole conversation. Those ones I find like quite challenging, and I have to often I'll like kind of like try and imagine like if I was seeing it as a play, like would they like trying to put in like fun gestures or like maybe change the angle, because otherwise it can get really boring. And I feel like I often feel that if I'm bored drawing something, maybe the reader is going to be bored reading it. But then the difference there is that, of course, like they're going to read it in maybe like 3 minutes and it's taken you, like 3 hours. So there's that kind of strange counterbalance, I think. Yeah,
that's really fascinating. It's because you get, I don't know, the time invested versus the time spent on reading a page is so kind of, there's such a disjuncture there in terms of the graphic novel form. That's kind of which is perhaps under recognized on some level. One of the things that I really like about your work in terms of those landscapes is also the importance of travel and the way in which the characters travel in different shapes and forms, both kind of through real journeys but also imaginary journeys. And I wanted to ask whether you felt that there was something kind of particular about the graphic novel that is well suited to sort of exploring different notions of travel and sort of transnationalism.
Is that a question for me?
Yeah,
I think so. I mean, I think you mentioned maps, and I think that's something that I always like to weave into my work, because I think it's such a like fun visual way of, I think I always just really liked books with maps when I was a kid. Like I loved like fantasy books that came with a map at the front, and you could like see where the characters were like journeying, and like they're going over hill and over dale and over mountain. Maybe there's a little dotted line and stuff. So I always liked that. And I think what I found fun about a graphic novel is like turning a sort of static map into something that the characters could like dip in and out of. And I quite like playing with the form. And you mentioned like different forms of travel, and I think like there's something really fun and liberating. Like if you were writing it as a book, you might have to like, you'd have to fill pages of description like showing a journey, whereas with a comic, a graphic novel, you can just like put a little boat on a map, do a ... and then that's the whole journey done. Then like boom, you can move on to the next thing. And I sort of enjoy those kind of time jumping devices that you can do like very elegantly visually, that I think you would have to put a lot more effort in if you were using prose to describe. So I love that. And also like visual devices like jumping in and out of panels. So if characters are jumping between like jumping from inside a story to another story, or inside, a character might be dipping into their own imagination or memory and back again. Like I think playing with the form, so you can show characters stepping in and out of panels, you can use color to sort of signify to your audience that something has changed like that. And that's why I love the form so much. I think it allows you to do so much with, I think, a fairly light touch.
Great, thank you. And so Quan, I'm just kind of, responding to that, because I was wanting to ask you how you felt you used the form in terms of those things about sort of transnationalism and travel and exchanges, because a lot of your work involves migration in different shapes and forms. And I also wanted to ask you about your latest work, which, you can read from one end, but then you flip the book around and you can read from the other end. And that seemed to me almost like a kind of spatial manifestation of the kind of two ways in which you're thinking about, both the work, but also migration and sort of dual nationality and those kinds of things.
For example, in Andalucinas por el Mundo, which is the 3 chapter happening in 3 different countries like France, Spain, and Miami, I connected like the difference and transnationality with the history of each sister. My sister goes to France, the other one goes to Florida, and I'm staying in Spain. So you can see the difference in color palettes, the voices, how each of one of us think. That was a lot of work working doing script with them, because, for example, my little sister said that she didn't want to see that novel and see that it's my vision of her, but she wanted to see her vision of herself. That involves color, background, voices, jokes, the people that were surround her, the environment. So that also happened with my bigger sister, but she wasn't quite as picky as my little sister. That was a surprise working with a script, because you expect a little sister you to say yes, and your bigger sister yes, no, do this and that. So it was a really, really nice work. And regarding gente de aquí and gente de allí, yeah, I had these two ideas, so the people can start reading with the part that they feel more curiosity for. So in my opinion, I thought that the Spanish people would start with the migrant part, like how to feel migrant and what are the stereotype and prejudice, and all the migrant and migrant descent community would start with the Spanish part. But I was mistaken, because people love to read and talk about themselves. So Spanish people start reading about the Spanish side, and the migrant and migrant descent start reading on the other side. So for me, it was very visible, and I want to make it physically. For example, for me, it's challenging to say somebody that the reading experience is going to be as nice in digital as physical. For me, this book was made for having it in paper, so you can turn it around. And it was going to add in vertical, but my publisher said no, enough, because you are going to take up the lector, I mean the reader from the narrative. You keep changing form with the book, so they kind of ended in the middle. And people say that to me, like, it is a very nice physical metaphor that you can relate. Here and there, it's a matter of perspective, and you can see that the color palette also changes. That because using red and yellow so explicitly, it might cause some rejection for certain part of the population in Spain because of political issues. I try to make it subtle, but have still like Spanish colors, and that the other color palette is totally different. I use a lot of blue and yellow and color not so bright as, for example, not so condensed, and gazpacho dulce, more pastel and friendly. But then in Gente de Aquí and Gente de Allí, it's barely any background, because I keep hating there with backgrounds. Nothing has changed.
Can I ask you both then about color, because you both referred to that in your answers here? Like, at what point do you sort of, when conceptualizing a page, at what point do you start thinking about color? Is that something that's there right from the start? Do you start with color and move on to sort of image, or is it something that comes in later? How do you kind of deal with color and coloring, and not necessarily just on a page, but also over a series of pages, because you talked about that there too. So I don't know, maybe Isabel, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think I've always found color like quite challenging, and I think for me, I like to limit my colors, because I think I can often, looking at my work, I think sometimes I can put too much on. So I try and like limit my colors a bit. And that, when I was starting out, that limit kind of was really helpful, I think. And I started using the limited color palette as a storytelling device. So I think in my latest book, Glasstown, I use it to signify, there's 3 different color palettes, and each one signifies a different one of the story narratives that run alongside each other. So you have the present day, which is the present day, so Charlotte Bronte's present day, when she's telling the story from, which is after her siblings have died and she's like reflecting, and I chose sort of like blue and gray hues for that. When she's talking about her childhood, it's in kind of sepia tones, but still like very pared down and muted, but the imaginary world I chose to show in sort of like full color, and that was like definitely a very deliberate choice. There's like very beautiful descriptions where the Brontes describe how they see their imaginary world, and Charlotte describes it as being like the skies being burning, and almost like the color and vividness of her imaginary world almost surpassed the reality. And so that was something that felt really important for me to be able to reflect visually. So that was like, that's probably the best example of how I've been able to like really satisfyingly use color. But in terms of how I decide what colors to use, I don't really plan in advance. It's kind of like I'll do the drawing, and then the color is the last thing I add on. So often for me, it's quite like a playful thing, and I'll like play around testing out different color palettes, see what works, and then sort of settle on something. But I usually do that last. So I'll have like penciled the whole book, drawn the whole book before I've necessarily like really decided on the color palette.
And you have complete liberty there. There's never any sense of a sort of a restriction from the publisher or anything like that.
No, I mean, most of my books have been printed. The thing is, I think like the way that the printing works, it tends to be that it's either black and white or full color. So there doesn't seem, I haven't yet been like told like, oh, it'll be too expensive to do full color, pick 2 colors, just because the way that the books I've done have been printed, it's been like color or not color. So yeah, no, not in terms of like a production thing.
A specific palette or anything.
Yeah, so no, that's one of the things I've enjoyed most. Yeah.
Okay, great. And Quan?
Yeah, for me, it was like experimented before starting coloring. Like I do some experiment with manual color because, for example, gente de aquí, gente de allí, it's on digital. It's all fully digital. So I play with watercolor, I play with color pencil, and then when I'm fine with one color palette, I digitalize them, pick the sample colors that I want to have, and leave it there. And then, you know, I create everything and then I start producing, because doing it on the go, doing it while I've drawn stuff, it is very not productive at all. And for example, for me, that I need to work for the graphic novel, and at least my another jobs from being not productive is just keep making longer and longer and longer the work that I need to have to make a graphic novel. And also for me, color, it is very powerful. I think I tried experimenting with black and white and grays and experimented with the bicolor, and I look really bad. It's just not my character. So I think my personality is very colorful, and like you said, the expression, the facials, the big mouth and the colorful is kind of also my signature all over these years, because I cannot get rid of color, and I do not wish to do that. Not to staying in one color palette, but mixing a lot of saturation, maybe a little bit of pastel, but yeah, color, a lot of color.
So, I mean, you talked a little bit there about technique as well. That was a question I was going to ask you about as well. So you talked there about sort of using watercolor and different techniques, but also digital. So can you just talk us through a little bit about your process of actually kind of creating a page, and perhaps give an indication of whether that's changed over time, or whether you think sort of working under COVID restrictions has had an impact on that technique in any way? Maybe Isabel, maybe you could start with that.
Yeah, for me, my technique has definitely not been impacted. I mean, I was like working mostly at home before COVID anyway, so my teaching job has been completely changed, but my illustrating hasn't like been affected so much in that way. I sort of like the technique I use is a mixture of digital and hand drawn. So I imagine we have some crossover techniques, but I do all the drawing is done by hand. So usually in like charcoal, pencil, or ink, depending on the story and the kind of the look I want. And then I'll scan in the artwork, like kind of change the saturation so that it, you know, maybe get rid of the paper, keep the blacks black and the whites white, but then I'll add the color digitally. And I like to keep all the texture of the materials. So, you know, if it's like pencil and charcoal, I like to keep the smudges and keep the kind of textural grainy quality. And then the color kind of I keep the color really flat and blocky, so that it almost lays behind the artwork. And that's kind of the technique. And then I'll add in my speech balloons and on top at the end digitally, and I have a sort of like font of my handwriting that I use for that as well.
I saw that in the back of the encyclopedia, your thanks to somebody for doing. I thought that was very cool.
Yeah, I've been using the same font since that first book. I always say, oh, I'll get a new one made, I'll try something different, and then each time I'm like, oh, I like that one.
Quan.
Yeah, for me, like the last thing you say about the fonts, at first I was breaking my head to find a font that I like, and then find a font that actually expresses that we were talking in different languages, because for me that it is very important to communicate in one language, that you are speaking 3 languages in one page. That was crazy. But that's just in the graphic novels. For example, when I draw for my social media, because I'm very active in Instagram, I ended ditching the fonts, and I just it's my handwriting. So, well, this is kind of a thing, but I practice a lot my handwriting. So the books that I sign, all the readers say, "Oh, your handwriting is so nice," and I was, yes, I practice a lot to do this for you. And about the technique, for me, for example, using like acrylic, watercolors, carboncillo, I don't know, charcoal, yeah, charcoal, pencil, using it more manual way, it's related to pleasure and experimenting. I do love, because I haven't done fine arts or an illustration model, what's what we say in Spain. I'm self-taught or autodidacta, so I like to play it a lot. But for example, for me, for executing one graphic novel or things in that manual ways is very time consuming. So I always experiment and play with that, but then I use mostly right now my iPad Pro with the Procreate, and I try to mimic it in a digital way because it's so much easier to send it to print or to send it to social media work, or that having it directly into digital rather than translating it, scanning it. And my house is small. If I put it in a scanner or we put everything, we could not live there anymore. So it has been very useful having this digital, just drawing in digital. And I also bought this paper-like thing to put it on the top of the iPad. So when you scratch and when you draw, it sounds like paper, because I really do like paper. But digital is very convenient.
I think you make it obviously a great point about your early work and the way that you use different fonts to indicate to the reader that different languages are being used. And that's, I think, one of the great things about the graphic novel, and I've seen it in other works, where you have this kind of multiplicity of fonts existing on the same page, and the reader can kind of quickly pick up on that dynamic. Was that something that you had seen somewhere else, or was that just something that you created for yourself?
I think I created it for myself, because one thing, well, this is public, but I wasn't reading comic because before I published, so I wasn't reading, neither drawing, but I wanted to do something, and I started to draw and to publish. So I really was struggling to, one, portray Chinese people, that you really notice that it was Chinese, because some of the people say to me, just draw 2 lines on the eye. And for me, that was very offensive, because the eyes is something that has a lot of forward expression. So if I put just 2 lines, and also I'm feeling the stereotype. So it was a big challenge for me to portray Chinese people and also to put the different languages. So I talked with my publisher, and they gave me some advice, like, why don't you just change the font? And I was looking through the fonts, which one look more Asian, which one look more Western, and how do they look together? Do they look nice? But I believe that sometimes my work, I really don't care if it look nice, like bonitismo, you know, like things to be nice. I really care more if it communicates what I want to say or if it doesn't. So sometimes those 3 fonts don't make any sense in a page. Maybe it's too much. But I think that maybe feel like something that it's overbearing really communicates what I'm trying to say. There is this one page in Andalucinas por el Mundo that me, my sister, and my mom, we are talking through social media, like WeChat. And there's so many bubbles of words and so many different fonts. And you get that my sister was like, oh, I cannot stop. I mean, it was overbearing, it was full of stuff. And you get the feeling that what was happening there.
But in some ways, I think that's the experience of being multilingual, right? I mean, and also, I don't mean that just in terms of, let's say, you know, Spanish and Mandarin, but different sort of social media means of communication, the telephone, all these kinds of things. So I think that's really interesting element of the work. I mean, you talk there again about your sisters, or your siblings, your brother as well. And of course, that's something else that you both have in common, that you've both done work with your siblings. So I wanted to ask you about that. And of course, in Isabel, in your case, your latest work is, of course, about siblings. So I suppose if this isn't too awkward a question, like, how do you feel like your siblings have influenced your work?
I guess I've always been like very drawn to stories about siblings, like particularly sisters, because I am so close with my sister, and I think when we were a lot younger, we didn't get along very well, like when we were children, and so it's like fascinating to me. I just love hearing about other people's sibling dynamics. Like I'm obsessed with like hearing people's sibling dynamics. So yeah, any stories about siblings, I'm just like I want to know more. And I think so that's probably why I was drawn to the Bronte the story of the Brontes, I think, was just because of this sibling dynamic. But in terms of like how my sister has influenced my work, I think we're very close, and we like share ideas a lot. And I would say like she's probably the first person that I will like show like run a story idea by, or discuss, like bounce ideas off. So in that way, she's very much influenced my work. And as you mentioned before, we have worked together on we do children's book stuff together. So she'll do like the writing and the research, I'll do the illustrations, and then we kind of we have this like nice crossover zone where I'll be like, oh, I don't want to draw that, can you change it? And she'll be like, okay, but can we put this joke in? And and that's a really nice, I've worked with other writers before, and usually it's very much like, here's the text, you go and illustrate it. And what's fun about working with my sister when she's the writer is that it's way more like, there's a lot more of a dialogue and a to and fro. And I've actually noticed that publishers like to keep the writer and the illustrator separate. And so that's why it's so fun for me, I think, working with my sister in that way.
When you say separate, you mean in the process of actually creating?
Yeah. I've done books before where like, I'll be sent the text and I won't have spoken to the writer. I won't, so very much like I'll just produce the illustrations, and then it's up to the publisher to mediate between the writer and the illustrator. Right. And I understand why, I do understand why that is, but I very much enjoy the process being a little bit more fluid and kind of, I guess, feeding off each other, because that's how I work when I'm writing my own stuff. I react to the images that I'm producing. I'll be quite flexible, I'll change it. If something doesn't feel like it's working, I'll just rewrite it, and that's not always possible if you're working with a set text. And so that's what I find enjoyable about it.
Can I then just briefly go back to the translation element, because you mentioned that you'd never spoken to any of your translators.
I have, like, briefly, but not in any great depth.
Right, okay. So it wasn't that the publishing house there did the similar thing where it was kind of mediating, or
I don't think so. I think I've had some like interesting email dialogues with a couple of them. Like there was I think it was for my first book, there was some really silly, like I'd done some silly wordplay with the place names, and they sent me like there was some like queries like, is this a joke? Does this need, like, how, like asking how it would translate best. So that's always been fun. I would have liked, I think, to have spoken more, but I think it's like you have to let people do their jobs, and I don't want to. Sure. Yeah.
Quan, what about you in terms of working with your siblings? Because obviously that's very present in your work right from the start. And in fact, you're kind of in the first book, Gaspacho says a lot of family trees as well. So it's kind of, if it weren't obvious enough, it's sort of constantly present. And a lot of it is about the sort of the also the dynamic of the male sibling who comes last, and that sort of dynamic within the family. But I was just wondering what you felt you'd learned from your different siblings, because well, my impression is that you have different relationships with all of them.
Yeah, you're right, James. I have very different relationship with them. So the funny thing is that when I was publishing Gaspacho, the first book, they didn't read it until it was published. So I just sent them the book, and that's, oh, this is a couple of memories that we have together. And there's one scene that my sister would kill the hamster. And she said, I was so embarrassed and so amused at the same time that I didn't know if to laugh or to cry. So we were laughing together, and it's kind of a recopilation of memories that surprisingly we all had. Like, this is not a memory just I had, but it's some shared moments that it was really precious to us that is in that book. So it was super nice to find out that all of us knew about that. But on the second book, it was like a brainstorming and a script work together. As Isabel was saying before, like, you kind of have dialogue if you feel comfortable with this or not, especially because I'm not telling jokes, I'm telling your life and whatever secrets you want to tell, not just my side. And I'm not doing the same after the first book, just publishing what I want to publish. So I learned not about the stories, because I know all of them story, we grew up together, but how is to work with them, how are the characters working together, how permissive or not permissive they are, how secure they are about doing the script or not. So it was different. And I also decided to be a female leading voice graphic novels, because Chinese people, well, not Chinese, have been invisibilized, but invisibilized, difficult word, but also the Chinese female or the Asian female is more than invisible. So it was a thought decision about making it a universal yet feminist Asian story. Because you can see all the reference that we have, if they are not stereotypical, they are mostly males, not females. So yes, well, basic that.
Yeah, and I mean, you did say a few things there about your kind of your research process and how you go about, because a lot of it is about sort of personal anecdotes. But in your latest work, I noticed that you start bringing in sort of statistics from information that you gathered and things like that. So can you talk a little bit about how you compile all the different sort of bits or elements of your work? And is that something you're kind of constantly gathering, or you know, just maybe talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, of course. I don't know if I consciously always make that or if I constantly gather that. I think I end up doing things for accident or for intuition. So in this late book, it was going to be a really tiny book about tips to do's and don'ts about how to socialize with migrant people. And it was just a series of jokes and vignetas, you know, small things. But I showed it to a friend and she said, why don't you get a little bit more of theory muscle? Explain something to people. That was just a phone call. And because I am very invested woman in things that I learn about, I started like researching, and then I ended doing this. And I always say to people that I did an express PhD because I studied a lot of politics papers, sociology, psychology papers, scientific paper that I am not scientist. I didn't go to any university. I didn't go to anything. So the researching of that book was really a nightmare, but really, really rewarding. I even interviewed one sociologist. So I always also tell that I have lived through many moments in my life that served me for my creation, for my comics, but I didn't know that there was so many people feeling the same about that, and that what we felt had a name. So I needed to study to put name on what I have lived about discrimination, about the identity issue, about like this fluid identity, about migration, things that we all live, but we don't know how to tell it. And then after studying so complex things, make it easy and fun for the reader to read and not just leave the book and say, oh no, I don't want to read it. The boring stuff, I did it before, so you don't need to do it right now, and you can do it after if you are interested in that stuff. So it was a very hard stuff. And then adding color, adding nice faces, adding expression, adding all the graphic to make it attractive to mainstream people that are not into race dialogues.
I mean, you talked there also about, I mean, you mentioned the word fun, and actually I think that's a really an important word in your work, right? I mean, there's a sense in which these are serious issues, but you can also use humor and tackle them through humor, and you don't have to necessarily always it seems that you don't take yourself overly seriously as well within the work, which is a nice kind of element. I don't know if that again was something you were doing kind of consciously, or whether that's just kind of your natural expression.
I think it's kind of my natural expression, but I evolved it, I evolved it. Well, I keep practicing it to make it a good thing in my work, because sometimes I feel that it's in activism, there is different dialogues that we need to have. Some people talk angrily, some people talk the manifest, and I use more gently your fun talk with to educate, I guess. Educate people is a big, because when people read gente de aquí, gente de allí, the handwriting and the jokes make easy to digest something that I'm telling you that is difficult and that is no good for you. Because nowadays people are super busy and we need to scratch even 15 minutes to have a call with somebody. So who is going to put themselves in a uncomfortable situation that they think they do not relate purposely? For me, it's difficult to see that. So I purposely use one thing that I know that I do good, which is to be charming and to communicate with humor and fun to somebody and making it easy to understand. So, but it's very difficult, James. It is a very difficult job.
Well, I mean, Isabel, maybe before we go on to talk about the research process, maybe I could also ask you about humor then, because you also have, there is also a sort of sense of play in your work. I noticed in the early work, encyclopedia, that there are sort of like little footnotes at the bottom of the screens, is like, you know, don't sort of expect this and that, sort of jokes to the reader. And also the character of Charles Wellesley in Glasstown has got a kind of element of playfulness in the way that he engages with Charlotte as well. So I suppose a similar kind of question, you know, like what function does humor have for you in your work?
Yeah, I think for me it is important that to temper everything with a light touch, a sort of humorous touch. I think you are asking, like, my work is quite dense and text heavy, and I think that is not necessarily what people reading graphic novels are like. Some graphic novels have no words, some are purely dialogue, and I use quite a lot of description in my panels as well as dialogue. And so I think for me, I like to give it just a humorous light touch if I can, just so that it doesn't feel like too stodgy and too hard to read through, you know. And also, like, I think that's just how I guess I think, and I like to keep it kind of natural and conversational if you can. And so yeah, it's the humor, keeping a humorous element is important, I think, to me. To not get too pompous, I suppose. Not take
yeah, and I think, I mean, probably, I don't know, but in both of your works, like, play is also has a sort of or humor has a social function as well, right? The sense of a kind of togetherness within the characters, but also between the book and the reader, right? There's a sense of a kind of a contract almost, that the humor draws that in. I think that's very kind of evident, I think, in both your works.
Yeah, I also think that, for example, talking about racism or hard stuff, it makes you more approachable, the topic, if you treat it with humor. So both parts can communicate if you're talking with a nice tone rather than angrily, because it's just a matter of communication. It's not the way that when you say something and you are calm and you are having fun and you're laughing, than when you are angry. It's just not it's just not for graphic novels. It is also in real life. It's not the same if I tell you, hey James, like super angry, the way that you're gonna react if I say, hey James, with a smile. So I think it is very important, the humor, in order to approach difficult topics.
Yeah, and I think in your case as well, the use of humor is the way in which you kind of destabilize the stereotype in a way, so that the stereotype is put forward, but because you also present it with humor, it's not, you know, that's what enables it to be sort of simultaneously undermined.
Yeah, totally. I agree with that, totally.
So maybe we can go back to the research process as well, because obviously there's a lot of research involved, particularly your last work. I guess all your work, but I was thinking the last work was, I mean, did you read all the kind of juvenilia? I actually don't know how much there is, but is there a lot? Did you read it all, and sort of how did you work with that material?
There is a lot, but no, I read like, I dipped in and out and I read a fair amount of it, but I also mostly just focused, I read a lot of companion texts to it that helped to unpack it, because it's really hard to read. It wasn't necessarily meant for, you know, they wrote it for each other when they were children and teenagers. And so a lot of it is quite confusing and rambling and dense, and really hard to get into in a way that their novels aren't. In my opinion, their novels aren't. So I reread all the novels. I read a lot of theory and stuff written about the juvenilia. And the other thing, I think there was a point where I realized that, like, I had to kind of stop researching, because I was getting so, I was finding more and more great stuff that I wanted to include, and the plot was ballooning and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So after a while I had to like close all the books. And then what I did is I did some research trips that were a bit more like primary research, I guess. So I went up to the Bronte parsonage in Yorkshire where they lived and where they grew up, and I did some like sketching. And I'm not really the kind of person, I've never been someone who like sits in a cafe and draws people. Like, I always really impressed by people who do that, but that's just not like something I do. And although I like draw for the love of drawing, I think for me it's mostly like I draw to tell a story. So I don't tend to, like, if I'm on holiday, I don't really do any work. I just like read books and laze around, you know, whereas I see people's like holiday sketchbooks, I'm like, oh, that's so good, I wish I did that. But if I'm researching, that's when I use my sketchbook. So I went up and I sketched around the parsonage and I drew little maps of all the rooms, and then I took a lot of photos as well, and then the sort of it all came together. So the photos, the little maps I drew, the visual research, like the kind of reading research I'd done and the notes I'd made, all helped me to kind of get a fuller picture. And I think for me, the most important thing about the research trips weren't necessarily like any visual material I gathered particularly. It was about like getting a feel for the place. And I think that story in particular, the place itself, felt very, very important to the narrative to me. And it felt very important to like understand why they had written those stories, and where they had been when they wrote them. And because I think place and environment and home it shapes you, it makes you who you are. And so seeing where they were when they came up with these strange stories, it felt like the starting point for me.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I mean, when I was much younger, went to Haworth and did the walk out to what was supposedly Wuthering Heights. I don't know if you did that walk, but it's basically nothing. It's tiny. Yeah, it's like a 2-room house in the moor, but somehow it didn't matter. It was not the image I had of it in my head, obviously from reading the novel Wuthering Heights, but it didn't seem to matter because everything was about atmosphere. And it's so loaded with atmosphere, the whole village and the parsonage and everything, and I think that really kind of comes across in the work. So I really kind of share that experience that you talked about. I also wondered whether that kind of like world that they create, it's so vivid, whether that sort of goes back to the question of sort of siblings, and whether you think would only be possible for siblings and people who are so close to each other and to spend so much time with each other and be so intimate with each other to create that kind of a world. And so interesting the way that they all intersect with each other through these imaginary worlds that they create.
Yeah, I think it must partly have been due to their closeness as siblings, but I also think to some degree it may have been down to like their isolation. I don't mean necessarily like, you know, geographically, because Haworth was like a bustling market town at times, and they were like, but I think as like children of the like reverend of the church, they would have been a little bit socially isolated, I think, from the other children in the village, and so they very much were like a unit of 4. And I think when I think about the kind of I guess the different factors and the different environmental like things that make you who you are now, you have like your friends, you go to school, you have TV, you have books, you have the internet. There's like so much stuff that can like feed into who you are, and so much things to do all the time. And I think when I like read about their childhood, I think a lot of it must have just come from this like extreme like boredom. Like, you know, you need to make your own world if your world is like, that's how I see it anyway.
Yeah, but also a world that becomes, by contrast, dangerous to your own real existence, because it becomes so powerful that it then sort of starts impacting the other way. I think that's fascinating. Okay, so I mean, we're sort of coming towards the end, so I wanted to ask you both a kind of question about trajectory, if you like. So Quan, in your case, you started with something that was very autobiographical and sort of based on your family, and then your last work is something that's kind of much broader in scope, and this kind of graphic essay exploring racism, and yeah, there's a kind of a sort of an instructive element to it in a sense, right? A kind of yeah, sort of almost like a kind of a manual in some ways, as you talked about before, right? You wanted a kind of do's and don'ts, almost like as a manual. So I just wondered if you could talk about that shift and maybe why you decided to take that particular path and sort of move away from those more, I mean, obviously it's autobiographical in the sense it's touching on themes that are important to you, but it's a very different approach. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I think all the works that I've done, it's because it was a key moment in my life. So when I started drawing about Gazpacho, it wasn't a graphic novel, it was a web blog, no, a blog, well, Tumblr. It was Tumblr in my time. So it was little jokes that I thought nobody was going to read. But then suddenly I wanted to publish something that was more longer, something that has a timeline, something that So I contacted my publisher and they accepted. So it wasn't something planned. And when I planned to do Gazpacho, I was also planning to do Andalucinas. It was one mixture, but I decided where to end because I haven't published one book in my life. I didn't know what to do so long. So I knew where it was going to end, but I didn't know the time at that time. And so publishing graphic novel is my second job. So it's not something that I need to keep pushing myself to publish to stay en la parrilla, how to say it in Spanish, not to stay on the media or else people will forget you because I have my other job. So I publish things when I really feel like to, and this feeling comes in important moments in my life. And when Andalucina finished, it was kind of emptying like almost 30 years of our life and condensing it in two books. It was intimate and it was autofiction because not everything is true because life is not organized. There is no suitable order, so you need to arrange things to make legible and to make entertaining. But then people ask me, will you keep doing autobiography? And I was like, let me live. Maybe in the future, if I become a mom or something, I will have something more interesting to tell. But at the moment, I'm enjoying other things. And I shifted to gente de aquí, gente de allí, because it is a different optic, like reflecting in something that I have lived, seeing what is the meaning of what I have lived, the racism and the relationship with people, things that you things that you live and then you reflect after. Like when you finish a relationship and after a couple of years when everything is healed, you see them think, oh, this guy was toxic. I permitted because I have low self-esteem, which is, I will not do it now, kind of like that, but towards race and migration of self-identity. So thinking towards the future, I hate it because it really makes me anxious to think about the future. I don't know what will be the approach, but I don't know if it's more autobiographic or more into studying, but because the things I do it really from the heart because I really believe in it. I think it will also encounter me. Not me encounter the thing, but whatever I'm going to produce in the near future is going to encounter me. I think it's been always like that, on the other way around.
Okay, well, that's a very nice way to end. Isabel, I wanted to ask you about your trajectory, but in a slightly different way, because the early works seem to sort of deal with stories that are, sort of based on existing stories and narratives and myths and things like that, but not necessarily things that are particularly well known. Whereas obviously Glasstown is dealing with very, very famous writers, not necessarily, and definitely not their sort of famous work, right? The sort of what otherwise might be regarded as the kind of the footnotes in some sense, right? But nonetheless, I wondered whether you felt a sense of responsibility to that history, given the kind of their sort of popularity and fame, and whether you found that a challenge or whether you just sort of were free to roam and you didn't mind that. And I know you put a disclaimer at the beginning of the book about how this, a lot of it is actually based on your imagination as much as the work, but I don't know if you felt that sense of responsibility through that shift.
Oh no, I really did. And I think I'd never really worked before with that kind of material. Also, like there was bits that, the stuff that was based on their biography, I felt like that had to be really historically, I wanted that stuff to be as accurate as possible in terms of like, just like dates and getting the timeline correct. Obviously in terms of like dialogue and how I imagine their personalities, I think that's, that was artistic license. But yeah, I was very aware that people who read it might not be coming to it as graphic novel fans or people who read my work previously, but they might be coming to it from fans of the Brontes. And so I did feel a responsibility to do the Brontes, I guess, justice in that way. I think what was really exciting for me was the book was reviewed after it came out by a couple of writers who had written Bronte biographies that I had read during the research stage, and that was like really very validating for me, because I think I did a lot of work, a lot of research went into that book, and I think most people who read it probably don't know how much research went in, and I put in lots of little, I guess, like jokes and hints about things that I'd read along the way, and it was really my favorite responses that I got from that book were from people who I guess whose work I'd respected during my research process. But I wouldn't want to necessarily do every book like that. Like that was a really fun experience, but I don't think I want to be like becoming a graphic biographer, and because it was hard. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next, but well, I'm doing a picture book next. I just had a baby, so my head is like full of like ideas for kids now, but I'm also thinking about what graphic novel will be next, and I don't yet know. I think the right story, I'll know when it's the right story, but I feel like I would like to do something quite different. I'm not sure what that is yet.
Well, maybe as Quan says, it will encounter you as much as you
I think stories are like that. You can't just sit down in front of a blank piece of paper and be like, it's time. You have to wait.
I totally agree.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us.
It's been really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. It was very emotional. We have learned a lot about the graphic novel. Muchísimas gracias por esta magnífica tertulia. Hemos aprendido mucho sobre el proceso creativo, sobre los sentimientos, sobre las historias, y espero que con esto, bueno, pues hayamos contribuido al interés, ¿no? Por la literatura, por las historias. Y bueno, pues muchísimas gracias, Isabel, Juan, James. Y recordar que los libros, las obras tanto de Isabel como de Juan están disponibles en nuestra biblioteca del Instituto Cervantes de Manchester. Hasta pronto, muchísimas gracias.
Hasta luego.
Thank you.